So it's good for us to be here to have to honor rather our veterans and those of our allies, and especially the members of our own 398th Bomb Group. Marilyn has asked me to share some thoughts and memories, which I reluctantly agreed to, as I get very emotional when speaking on this subject. Originally, actually until last night, I planned to talk about the October 15th, 1945 Delancey mission and the 604th that with the noses shot off with flak, and they were able to bring the plane back to this very base. So, but in rethinking it, you know, most all of us, most all the 398s and families are aware of that mission, and if not, please go to our own webpage, 398.org, and look up the Delancey mission. It's very well done. It's Alan Ostrom's original story write-up that he did, and did an excellent job in the remembrances. So. And also I have a significant write-up on it if you're interested in a little different slant on it. But great story, but most of you are familiar with it. So I thought that even though this is a fantastic story, I think it's fitting to talk about the one airman on that mission that was KIA on that plane, Sergeant George Abbott. You see, the only thing you'll read about in the write-ups and the stories that incident is, quote, George Abbott, Sergeant George Abbott, Lebanon, Pennsylvania, KIA. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to give you some insight on the man who didn't come home. But first, I thought, I was thinking it'd be to look at the war from a macro standpoint, and then understand that everyone, when you talk about the numbers and these losses, everyone was a child of God. Every soul we lost. So, in researching last night, you come up with so much data. You get on Wikipedia and come up with it, and it's mind-boggling. But the whole thing can be summed up in about 30 seconds in terms of numbers. It was World War II. Many people don't realize it was the deadliest event, the most tragic, with the biggest numbers in the history of mankind. The tens of millions that were killed. We're looking in total dead. World War II casualties vary greatly. Now listen to this. Estimates of total dead range from 50 million to over 70 million. 75 years later, we can't get within 20 million of the number of people that died in that war. It's mind-boggling. So it was the deadliest war, and as in most wars, again, I find people aren't aware of this, many more civilians died than combatants. Civilians killed totaled around 47 million, including 20 million from war-related disease and famine. Total military dead, about 25 million, including deaths in captivity of about 4 million. Axis dead, approximately 11 million. Allied dead, about 61 million. Big numbers, big numbers. So I want to talk about one of those numbers. I say I would like to, but whenever I do, I fall apart. So Marilyn has volunteered to share some information with you about George Abbott, who was KIA on that mission. If you come and help me out right now, I appreciate it, and then I'll pick up afterwards. So. And with this little assistance, Marilyn says that with everything else she's done for me, she's carried me longer than my mother.
All right, first I'm reading a letter that George Abbott's sister wrote to her family. And this is written January 20th of 2006. Dear loved ones, when Davis sent us the enclosed email, a flood of memories rushed into my mind. I decided to call George Abbott Ledoux the next day and had a very nice talk with him. To think there is another George Abbott Ledoux Jr. is awesome. I decided they should know what a wonderful young man their namesake was, and so have written things I remember about our George. After all these years, I'm sure you'll appreciate reading what I have written. Love you all, Bert, Mother, Grandma, Aunt Bert. So this is about George Edward Abbott, born April 8th, 1925, killed in action October 15th, 1944, not 45. George Edward Abbott was the only son of Edward and Anna Abbott. George was born in a hospital in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on April 8, 1925, and was raised in Mount Lebanon, a suburb of Pittsburgh. He was second oldest of 4 children. His 3 sisters, all of whom are living as of January 15, 2006, are Elizabeth, age 83, Lois, age 78, and Bertha Burt, age 77. Elizabeth lives in New Hyde Park on Long Island, New York. She has 1 married daughter, Diane. Lois Peter lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. She has 3 sons, 2 of whom live in Raleigh and a 3rd in Richmond, Virginia. Each son has 2 children. Lois's oldest, George Edward Peters, who was the first grandchild of my mother, was named after my brother. Lois' second son is Richard, and William is her 3rd. Bertha Burt, now 77, lives in Mount Lebanon during the summer in Boca Raton in Florida in the winter months. My husband Ben and I have 3 children, Carol, who lives in Westchester, Pennsylvania, David, and Susan, who lives in Delray Beach, Florida. We are blessed with 4 grandchildren. George attended Lincoln Public School. When George was 8 years old, our father died from high blood pressure at age 47. Elizabeth was 11, Lois 6, Bert 5. The depression was in full swing. Our one saving grace was that our daddy had built and owned our home. $1,000 worth of insurance paid for his hospital and funeral bills. Mother had moved us children to 2 third-floor bedrooms and rented the 2nd floor of our home out as an apartment. George was very conscious and would cut lawns and shovel walks to earn money. He also sold subscriptions to Liberty magazine. At 12 years of age, he was able to get a paper route. In rain, sleet, and snow, he was trustworthy and always delivered the paper. One story we tell is that George had a customer who every week when we went to collect the money, he would say he only had a $10 bill. Of course, papers only cost 3 cents in those days, so $10 was a huge amount. Mother saved money for several weeks so that George could change the $10 bill. When he went to collect, the man said all he had was a $10 bill. George said he was able to change that, whereupon the man came back and said he had made a mistake and it was a $20 bill. I don't recall how the story ended, but there are some terrible people in the world. George liked to play baseball, and the boys in the neighborhood played on the vacant lot next to our house, until one day, one of the boys hit a line drive into our neighbor's stained glass window. It didn't break, but then they never played there again on the vacant lot. We did get a basketball hoop, and all the boys in the neighborhood came to play. George wanted a bike so bad, and finally, he saved up $12 to buy a secondhand bike. He wouldn't let us girls ride it. It was so special. However, one day he was out collecting for his paper route, and he parked the bike at the curb. A man backed his car up and wrecked the bike. He blamed George for leaving it there, and wouldn't pay him a cent. How sad. George was a Boy Scout, very active in the troop, which met at our church. We belonged to the Mount Lebanon United Presbyterian Church, and George was active in the Young People's Group as well as Sunday School. Another story I remember about George, he needed a winter coat, but there wasn't money to buy one, so Mother went to the Salvation Army to get a coat for him. She brought home a package that was wrapped in brown paper. Mother tore a small hole in the paper which exposed a bright orange plaid material. All of us kids stood there aghast. George said, "I would rather freeze to death than wear that coat." We girls all agreed. However, when the package was completely open, we discovered a navy blue coat with an orange plaid lining. What a relief. When George turned 16, he started to work in a grocery store after school and on Saturdays. He wanted to learn to drive, but our car was so old, he hated the thought of being seen in it. Mother did teach him to drive it, and if we girls were driving along with him, we had to promise not one word be said. George was a very handsome boy, and we girls were so proud he was our brother. When George turned 18 years old, the draft was in full swing, and George definitely didn't want to be drafted in the Army, so he enlisted in the Air Force. He went into a program in which he was to become a pilot. He did not finish high school, however, but Mount Lebanon High School graduated him and gave him a diploma when the class graduated. George was a very good student. When he came out of the service, George wanted to go to Penn State and become an engineer. George was sent to Texas for the pilot program. However, he was only there a short time when they did away with that program and made him a side gunner on a B-17. He did come home on leave before being sent to England. After arriving in England, they sent George to school to become a tugleer. On a mission over Cologne, Germany, on October 15, 1944, George was killed. Our hearts were broken. George was buried in a cemetery in England. When the war ended, 8 months later, everyone was ecstatic. We were happy the war was over. But Mother and we girls could only cry, if only. After the war, our family brought George's body home. George is buried in the Mount Lebanon Cemetery, along with our mother and father. Anna Abbott was a fabulous mother and a wonderful grandmother. She lived with us for 25 years. When she no longer knew us, we placed her in a wonderful nursing home about a mile from our home. She received excellent care, but it's sad to see someone you love die inch by inch. She's now in heaven with Daddy and George.
Thank you, Marilyn. Don't worry, I'll pick up on the crying where you left off. I apologize if it's a little verbose, but George's family would be very pleased that we're able to share his story with this group. So, as most people are not aware, George was trained as a waist gunner. But on this particular mission, he was in the togglier's seat, which is, as you may or may not know, on a B-17, the toggler and the navigator in their own little compartment out front, and that is, of course, if you've seen the picture where the flak came up and blew the nose off the plane, and George took a big bunch of the blast, even though Dad's flak suit and parachute were blown off of him and he was knocked up against the firewall unconscious. He was able to regain consciousness and plot a course home back here, and the rest is history, as they say. And after he finished his tour, he plotted his course home, a little town in Woodburn, Oregon, and married the love of his life, and increased the population of that town by 10. So when you go out to Duxford, you look at a picture of that plane. The story underneath it says that the navigator was killed instantly, and I went up and tried to correct it with the Kilburn, and I said, if that's true, then Mom's got a lot of explaining to do. So, as was mentioned, my parents named me after George Abbott, And they stayed in contact with George's mom, Anna Abbott, until she passed away. And I maintained contact with his sister, Bertha. Bert, as she likes to be known. And as a matter of fact, she called me out of the blue just a month or so ago. And my son happened to be there, who was also named George Abbott. And they got to speak together. And it was wonderful, wonderful. So here we are 75 years later, and there have been wars in each generation, Vietnam, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. And as a matter of fact, we need to remember we have men and women at this very moment in 80 countries around the world, our military. So I personally believe, as parents and grandparents, we have an obligation to teach our children and our grandchildren about how exceptional our country is, and learn about, understand concepts like for God and country and no one left behind, and do whatever it takes, and to honor those who have served, especially on Memorial Day and Veterans Day. So I can think of no better way to close than with the words of President Lincoln at Gettysburg. He said, it's fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hollow this ground. For the brave men who struggled here have consecrated far above our poor power to add or detract. Thank you, God bless, and God bless our veterans.